Why was she sitting there in plain view when nobody had seen her arrive? The staging area was alive with the rhythm of routine, gear checks, quiet conversations, the metallic clicks of bolts being tested, the muted scrape of boots against concrete. Seals moved with precision, every man locked into his role. But then someone noticed her. A woman. Sitting on a low concrete barrier near the equipment tables, her dark hair pulled back in a simple knot, a leather-bound notebook resting across her lap. She shouldn't have been there. Every man in the compound knew the rules. This was a facility that didn't exist, buried in the heart of Nevada desert, its coordinates missing from every map, its airspace so restricted that even satellites caught only static interference when passing overhead. The perimeter bristled with motion detectors, sensors buried deep in the sand, and armed guards whose eyes never softened. Nobody walked in. Nobody drifted through. And yet here she was, flipping through pages of neat, precise handwriting as if she had all the time in the world. Petty Officer Harrison muttered to himself as he adjusted his breaching gear. "Hell is she doing here?" His voice was a low growl, but his eyes didn't leave her. Staff Sergeant Murphy shot a glance at his commander, Lieutenant Commander David Stevens, the kind of man whose presence carried the weight of countless deployments, followed their gaze. He squinted against the hard desert light. He'd seen all kinds of inspectors before. Budget men from Washington, brass with stars on their collars, even the occasional CIA shadow. But none of them had ever looked like her. No rank, no insignia, no clipboard, just that journal. The morning heat shimmered, warping the edges of her figure like a mirage. But she wasn't some hallucination born from exhaustion. She was real. And calm, too calm. Stevens approached, boots grinding over the gravel. He kept his tone clipped, respectful, but edged with irritation. "Ma'am, this area is restricted to mission-essential personnel only." She looked up slowly as though she'd been expecting him. Her eyes were dark, steady. They carried no fear, no surprise, only patience. She slipped a laminated badge from her pocket, holding it between two fingers. It flashed with holograms, security codes, markings Stevens had only seen in top-tier Pentagon briefings. He recognized them instantly, and he didn't like that recognition at all. "I have authorization to observe," she said. Her voice was measured, pleasant, but immovable. "Proceed with your preparation." She returned to her notes, as if the conversation was already finished. Stephen studied the badge, catching the light as it shifted across coated layers. Genuine, too genuine, the kind of clearance that raised more questions than it answered, higher than his own, higher than anyone's he knew. When he turned back to his men, he found them exchanging glances. None of them dared speak openly, but the message was clear. "Who is she?" Murphy muttered just loud enough for Harrison to hear. "Probably some efficiency analyst from DC, gonna count bullets, see if we're cost-effective." But even Murphy didn't sound convinced. That morning sun kept climbing, burning the desert floor until it shimmered like molten glass. The facility walls radiated heat. Sweat traced lines down the men's necks, but she, Collins, as the name on the badge suggested, looked untouched, composed. She didn't even flinch when, moments later, a breaching charge misfired with a flash and a concussive crack that rattled teeth. Every seal ducked, cursed, checked reflexively for damage. She just kept writing, not even a glance up. Stevens noticed. He filed it away in silence. Civilians didn't sit still through explosions like that. By 700 hours, the operation briefing began. The exercise had been designed as one of their most grueling, Operation Blind Rescue. Hostages buried 40 meters below ground, opposition waiting in the tunnels, no clear maps. It was meant to push them into chaos, to measure how quickly they adapted. But Stevens felt something already shifting, a current he couldn't name. As he pointed to diagrams, outlining breach points and extraction paths, he kept catching sight of at the edge of the room. She didn't scribble like an outsider trying to keep up with jargon. She wrote methodically, as though she already understood every abbreviation, every call sign, every nuance of tactics being laid out. She never asked a question, never hesitated, never betrayed ignorance. Murphy leaned close to Harrison again. Not a budget analyst, look at her. She knows exactly what she's hearing. Harrison grunted. If she's CIA, she's the strangest one I've ever seen. Not CIA, Murphy replied, his eyes narrowing. Something else. His pen scratched steadily across the page, each stroke precise, as though every detail mattered. Stevens forced himself to continue the briefing, but unease threaded through every sentence. He'd led men through firefights on 3 continents, stared down enemies who wanted nothing more than to see him dead. None of it unsettled him the way her calm gaze did. When the men dispersed to gear up, he caught her watching them move, as if measuring them. Not in the detached way of an observer, but like someone who knew what it was to carry that same weight on her own shoulders. He told himself he was imagining it, but deep down he knew he was. The Nevada desert was merciless. Wind carried the sting of sand across exposed skin. Heat made the air ripple, swallowing the horizon in waves. And yet inside the underground compound, the chill of steel corridors and fluorescent light made it feel like another world altogether. This was no ordinary training ground. It was a labyrinth built to test not just skill, but survival itself. Mock embassies, tunnels carved through rock, chambers that mimicked caves in Afghanistan or bunkers in Eastern Europe, every inch designed to blur the line between exercise and combat. Stevens' team had worked together long enough that words were rarely necessary. They moved in sync, breacher, medic, sniper, comms, each man a gear in a perfectly tuned machine. But as they prepared, he caught them sneaking glances toward the observation platform, where leaned against the railing, still writing. Her presence wasn't just strange, it was distracting, and in this world distraction killed. He shook it off. Focus. 12 hostages waited below. Resistance would be heavy. This was what they had trained for. And yet, when shifted, just slightly, as if listening to something no one else could hear, Stevens felt a chill despite the heat. Something was wrong. He couldn't name it, couldn't prove it, but instinct screamed at him. And instinct was something men like him learned never to ignore. She shouldn't have been here. She shouldn't have existed at all. And yet, in the hours to come, every man in that team would come to realize that Collins wasn't there by accident. She was there because she knew what was coming. And when the desert swallowed the facility whole, when communications went dark, when lives hung by a thread, it would be her, the woman with no orders, no mission, no official name, who would stand between them and the silence of the grave. But none of them knew that yet. For now, she was just the ghost in the notebook, the phantom soldier no one understood. How do you prepare for an enemy you can't see? The team moved with the efficiency of men who had rehearsed every detail 100 times before. Boots struck the concrete in quiet rhythm as Stevens led them down into the belly of the compound. The corridors grew colder with every step, shadows tightening like a noose around their formation. Collins followed at a distance, not close enough to interfere, not far enough to be forgotten. Always there, always watching, her notebook pressed against her chest as though it were body armor. Stevens had already decided she was a problem. Distraction, anomaly, liability, whatever label fit, she carried it with her silence. And yet, he couldn't ignore that strange sense of composure she radiated, like she belonged here in ways even his own men didn't. The staging chamber loomed ahead. Concrete walls, fluorescent lights, folding tables lined with gear arranged to military precision. Each man approached his station without hesitation. Harrison, their breacher, crouched over blocks of C4, wiring with the delicate care of a jeweler setting stones. His hands were broad but steady. Murphy powered up his electronic warfare kit, screens flickering to life with green spectrograms and scrolling data. His fingers moved fast, calibrating sensors, pinging frequencies, establishing digital eyes where physical ones couldn't reach. Turner checked his comms rig, testing channels, his brow furrowing as he cycled through encrypted bands. Static, then clarity, then static again. He shook it off. Training facilities always had quirks. Williams, the medic, laid out his trauma kit in perfect rows. Gauze, injectors, clamps, saline. He whispered the sequence under his breath like a prayer. Jackson cleaned the lens of his sniper scope, his world shrinking to crosshairs, light and distance. They were ready, always ready. But then appeared again. No one saw her enter. One moment the room was theirs alone, the next she was standing by the far wall, pen in hand, head tilted like she was already predicting the outcome. Stephen swore she hadn't passed him in the corridor. "Ma'am," he said, letting the irritation slip this time, "this is restricted. Observation is up there." He gestured toward the platform above the chamber. She lifted her laminated badge again, wordless. The look in her eyes was enough. She wasn't asking permission. She wasn't explaining herself. She was reminding him that her clearance his, and no argument he could make would matter. Stevens clenched his jaw and turned back to his men. Focus. Mission first. Always mission first. He tapped the diagram pinned to the wall. Insertion point. Ventilation shaft Charlie 9. Depth 40 meters. Hostages in central chamber coded Omega-1. Resistance unknown, numbers unconfirmed. Expect checkpoints every corridor. Live fire simulation rounds, concussion effects. Treat it as real, but remember, this is training. The words felt thin, even as he said them. His men nodded, no hesitation, no doubts. And yet's pen scratched again, steady, relentless, like she was documenting something already unfolding, not waiting to unfold. Stevens forced himself to ignore it. The order came down from overhead speakers, a metallic voice cutting through the hum of equipment. Operation Blind Rescue is now active. Alpha Team, proceed to insertion. The men moved out, boots striking steel as they descended into the shaft. The air cooled further, tinged with the metallic taste of recycled oxygen. Emergency lights painted the corridors in blood-red glow, every shadow alive, every echo sharpened. Check in, Turner's voice murmured over the comms. Comms live, all channels green. Copy, Stevens replied. They advanced in formation, rifles raised, movements choreographed by years of training. Every man knew his place. Every step was a part of the dance. And yet the facility didn't feel like training. Concrete walls bore scars from previous blasts, bullet holes etched into corners. Black soot streaked across ceilings. Dust clung to the air like it had been shaken loose not hours ago, but minutes. Williams muttered softly, "Looks too fresh." "Eyes forward," Stevens ordered. They reached the first checkpoint, a reinforced steel door exactly as briefed. Harrison moved up, laying charges with swift, practiced ease. His voice came low over the comms. 30 seconds to breach. The explosion was controlled, dust spilling into the corridor. Smoke curled, settling slow, but when it cleared, they weren't looking at an open passage. Another barrier, solid, unmarked, not in the diagrams. Murphy frowned at his display. "That's wrong. Plans show a straight corridor here, nothing about secondary barricades." Stevens stepped forward, scanning. Could be a misprint. But his gut said otherwise. Turner tried the comms. "Exercise control, this is Alpha Team. We've hit an unlisted obstruction at checkpoint 1. Request clarification." Only static answered. He cycled frequencies, backup channels, emergency bands, nothing. "Control, do you copy? Alpha Team requesting sitrep." Silence. The team exchanged glances. Stevens' pulse quickened. Training exercises were unpredictable, yes, but safety protocols were not. There was always a line, someone at the surface monitoring, ready to pull the plug if danger pushed too far. This silence wasn't protocol. This was failure. Or worse. His face flickered in his mind. The way she hadn't flinched at the explosion earlier. The way she seemed almost prepared for this. He pushed the thought aside. Focus. Harrison, prep another breach, he ordered. But even Harrison hesitated. Sir, that obstruction, it's not reinforced like the first. Doesn't look like facility standard. Murphy's scanner beeped, showing anomalies in the structure. This wasn't built as part of training design. Somebody modified this place. The air thickened. The red glow of the emergency lights deepened. Then Jackson, watching the far corridor through his scope, froze. Movement. The team stilled. Where? Stevens whispered. Jackson adjusted his lens. Sector 2, multiple figures, not ours, moving with discipline, tactical spacing. You mean role players? Jackson exhaled slowly. No, sir, these aren't actors. These guys know what they're doing. And then came the sound. Sharp words in a foreign tongue, bouncing through the ventilation system. Metal clicks, magazines locking into place. Boots pounding concrete in patterns that spoke of coordination, not improvisation. The seals stiffened. Williams's whisper carried through the comms. Sir, this isn't a drill. Stevens felt the truth land heavy in his chest. No control, no comms, modified layouts, foreign voices, real weapons. Somewhere above them, in the unseen passageways, Collins closed her notebook and vanished into shadows only she seemed to know. And for the first time in years, Stevens felt it, the thin edge of fear. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. And none of them knew yet how far the trap had been set. What happens when the ground beneath you stops following the map? The second breach went off with a thunderclap. Dust billowed, choking the corridor, forcing masks into place. Harrison's charges did their work, but what lay beyond wasn't clarity. It was confusion. Another corridor that bent the wrong way. Walls reinforced with materials Murphy's scanners struggled to read. Angles that didn't match schematics. This isn't our facility anymore, Murphy muttered, eyes glued to his flickering display. These layouts weren't in the plans. Someone restructured the grid. The men moved forward, tension rippling through every gesture. Their rifles tracked corners like predators hunting in an unfamiliar jungle. Every echo became a threat. Every shadow stretched too long. Turner pressed fingers against his comms earpiece, frustration biting his voice. Control, Alpha Team, do you read? Acknowledge. Only static. He cycled frequencies again. Backup channels, even the emergency red lines. Dead air, or worse, interference. Hisses and pulses like someone deliberately jamming. They've cut us off, Turner said flatly. Stevens felt his stomach tighten. No command link, no overwatch, no lifeline. He glanced at his men, the best, most disciplined operators he'd ever known, but even they weren't unshakable. Eyes darted, breathing shallow. Every one of them knew that silence on the net meant exposure. And then Jackson spoke, low and steady. Visual confirmation, sector ahead. 3 tangos moving in formation, not role players, too disciplined. The team froze. Uniforms? Stevens asked. Dark gear, mixed kit, non-standard. They're carrying AK variants with attachments I don't recognize. Jackson adjusted his scope. They're real, sir, not blanks. The silence that followed carried weight. Real meant lethal. Real meant no second chances. Williams broke it. Sir, what the hell is going on? Training scenarios don't put live hostiles in our laps. Stevens forced calm into his voice. We stay sharp. We adapt. That's the job, defensive posture. No one fires unless engaged. But even as he said it, unease gnawed at him. This wasn't adaptation. This was deception. The facility shuddered as if on cue. A low vibration ran through the walls, a deep metallic groan. Then the overhead lighting flickered, once, twice, and half the corridor went dark. Emergency strobes kicked in, pulsing red like a heartbeat. Murphy's eyes went wide at his screens. They're manipulating the system, shutting us down sector by sector, locking doors, venting air. This is coordinated. Stevens pressed. Murphy hesitated, then said what they all dreaded. Hostiles have control of the grid. The team exchanged looks. Nothing more needed to be said. Whoever they were facing had inside access. That meant intel leaks. That meant betrayal. And then the voices came clearer. Not English. Harsh consonants barked commands echoing through ductwork. Russian, maybe Eastern European, maybe worse. "They're closing on us," Jackson said. The team shifted into defensive positions, rifles braced against shoulders. Harrison palmed the detonator for a fallback charge, sweat sliding down his temple. Williams checked his med kit again, knowing instinctively it would be needed soon. The footsteps grew louder, boots striking concrete in perfect cadence. A squad, maybe two. They weren't rushing. They weren't sloppy. They were hunting. Then, a whisper of movement behind them. Stevens spun, weapon raised. Nothing. Just the stretch of corridor, shadows twitching under strobe light. But he knew. Was gone. She had been at his 6 only minutes earlier, silent as ever, notebook in hand. Now she was simply not there. No sound of retreat. No glimpse of her passing. Just vanished as if the walls had opened to swallow her whole. Stevens' heart thudded once hard. Where did she go? How and why now? No time for answers. The first went off in the corridor ahead. White light flared, shockwave hammering eardrums, smoke swallowing visibility. Training reflex kicked in. The men ducked, covered, reoriented. But this wasn't training ordinance. The concussion was real, the aftertaste chemical acrid. "Contact front," Jackson barked. Figures moved in the haze. Black silhouettes, rifles raised. Suppressive fire erupted, the sharp crack of live rounds ricocheting off concrete, sparks snapping inches from Stevens' head. This wasn't simulation, this was combat. "Return fire," Stevens roared. The corridor exploded into chaos. Jackson fired precise, disciplined shots, dropping the first hostile through smoke. Harrison's charges detonated at choke points, collapsing part of the passage and slowing the advance. The facility trembled with each blast. Williams dragged Harrison back from open fire when shrapnel grazed his arm. Blood spattered concrete. His eyes widened. That's not paint, that's real. Stevens fired 3-round bursts, every shot purposeful. But their ammo loads, he realized with horror, were live. Not blanks, not. Whoever had packed their gear had switched the kits. Someone had set this up. Murphy's voice shook as he reported, intercepting hostile comms. "They're encrypted, coordinated. These guys aren't they're military." Stevens' thoughts raced. Why here? Why now? Who knew their training schedule, their parameters, their weaknesses? And in the shadows above, unseen by all but Murphy's flickering thermal readings, Collins was moving. Not scribbling notes, not watching, moving. Through hidden service tunnels, she slipped like water through cracks. She carried no rifle, no heavy gear. Just compact equipment strapped under her jacket, sleek devices humming faintly, tools no standard carried. She paused at sealed doors, fingers brushing coated panels, and locks that had seals minutes earlier clicked open for her. She moved deeper, toward systems that controlled power, air, and surveillance. Her face was calm, unhurried, as though she had expected every step, every barrier, every hostile presence. Back in the choke point, the seals were burning ammo fast. Return fire rattled the walls. Sparks showered from overhead conduits. Enemy rounds punched holes through concrete chips. "We're pinned," Harrison yelled over gunfire. Stevens gritted his teeth. Every instinct screamed at him. This wasn't a failed drill. It was a trap. And somewhere in the shadows, the one person who shouldn't have been here, the woman with no orders, no mission, was navigating it like she'd been waiting for this exact moment. But for whom? And why? The enemy pushed closer, suppressive fire tightening around their position. The SEALs braced for breach. And far above, Collins closed her notebook for good. The phantom soldier was done watching. What do you do when the enemy knows your playbook better than you do? The corridor shook with another explosion. Concrete dust rained down, stinging eyes and choking lungs. Sparks leapt from shattered wiring, turning smoke into a strobe of orange and red. Every breath came ragged, every heartbeat loud. "Contact left," Jackson shouted, his rifle barking twice. A shadow dropped, but another moved in to take its place, advancing with unnerving discipline. "They're bounding," Stevens realized aloud. His men knew what that meant: coordinated suppression, professional tactics. These weren't mercenaries, these weren't actors, they were trained soldiers, and they were here to kill. Rounds chewed the walls, punching through concrete as if the building itself were betraying them. Harrison's charges had slowed the first wave, but more boots thundered in the darkness beyond. Too many, too organized. Murphy hunched over his screens, sweat streaking his temples. "They're communicating across multiple bands. Sophisticated encryption. I can't break it fast enough, but they're tracking us. Real time." Williams cursed under his breath as he pulled Harrison back again, the breacher clutching his bleeding arm. "We can't hold this position, sir. Not like this." Stevens knew he was right. Defensive positions only worked if you had relief, resupply, or an escape route. They had none. He tapped his comms instinctively, knowing full well it was pointless. "Control, this is Alpha Team. Actual contact. Hostile forces confirmed. Requesting immediate extraction." Static, nothing but static. A hollow dread settled in his chest. They were on their own. The enemy pressed closer, their fire deliberate, methodical. Stevens watched their angles, their spacing, their economy of movement. It was like fighting a reflection, an enemy trained in the same doctrines, anticipating the same maneuvers. "They know us," Stevens whispered. "They've studied us." Another erupted, white fire searing retinas. The concussion slammed into bodies, rattling bones. For a moment the team staggered blind. And then something changed. The gunfire ahead faltered, screams cut short. A burst of Russian barked orders, then silence. Murphy looked up sharply from his display. Multiple heat signatures dropping, fast, precise. "That's not us." Stevens' instinct screamed, "Eyes on." Jackson's scope swept through smoke. He caught flashes, muzzle fire, but not like theirs, suppressed, surgical, each burst followed by a body collapsing into shadow. "Boss," Jackson breathed, "someone's engaging them. One operator, maybe two, moving faster than I can track." Stevens' mind raced. Reinforcements. No, too clean, too quiet. Whoever was out there wasn't fighting with their playbook. They were rewriting it. A corridor door behind them hissed open, a door sealed minutes earlier by hostile control. The men froze, rifles trained. And in that doorway, framed by smoke and the faint glow of emergency lights, stood Collins. No notebook this time, no quiet observer. Her jacket was gone, replaced by sleek dark gear that blended with the shadows. Straps held compact devices across her chest, not SEAL issue, not standard military, something else. She moved with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times. No wasted steps, no hesitation. In her hands, not a rifle, but a compact weapon Stevens didn't recognize. It purred more than it cracked, a whisper of suppressed fire that stitched through the corridor. 2 hostiles fell before the SEALs could even register her movement. She didn't look at them, didn't explain. She just advanced, every motion controlled, deliberate, quiet. Stevens' men stared, stunned. Harrison mouthed a word he didn't even believe: CIA. But Stevens knew better. No agency analyst moved like that. No budget inspector carried herself like a ghost in combat. Williams found his voice. "Sir, who the hell is she?" Stevens had no answer. The hostiles regrouped, pressing their attack. Rounds sparked around, but she moved before they found her, flowing into cover, returning fire with surgical precision. One by one, the enemy fell, confusion unraveling their discipline. "Shift right," Stevens barked, seizing the moment. His team repositioned, forming a wedge, driving through the chaos. For the first time since this nightmare began, momentum tilted their way. But questions pressed harder than bullets. Who was she really? Why was she here? And how did she know exactly where to be, exactly when to appear? The fight dragged them deeper into the facility, through corridors warped beyond the maps they had studied. Every door they expected locked was open. Every choke point they feared became an escape, was always ahead of them, slipping through shadows, manipulating panels, guiding them without a word. Murphy muttered as they advanced, "She's leading us. She knows the layout, knows the systems." "She's not one of us," Jackson said. "No," Stevens replied, his voice low, "but she's not one of them either." Another firefight broke out near Sector 5. The hostiles were entrenched, using elevation crossfire. It should have been a kill zone, should have cost them dearly. Slipped away. One moment she was there, the next she was gone. Seconds later, emergency lighting failed overhead. In the sudden darkness, the hostiles' fire faltered. Suppressed bursts whispered through the black. Screams followed. When the lights flickered back, the enemy was down. All of them. The SEALs hadn't fired a shot. Williams whispered the thought aloud. "She's cleaning house." But Stevens wasn't comforted. He wasn't reassured. He was unsettled. Because this wasn't how missions worked. This wasn't how war was fought. And yet somehow it was happening. The phantom soldier was no longer a ghost with a notebook. She was something far more dangerous. And Stevens knew, without understanding how, that their survival now depended on her. But what kind of ally operated outside orders, outside recognition, outside the very existence of records? He didn't know yet. All he knew was that Collins had just tipped the balance of life and death. And he wasn't sure if that made him grateful or afraid. What happens when even the best begin to break? The firefight raged through Sector 5. Smoke clogged the air, bullets snapped past ears, and the steel walls rang like church bells struck by hammers. The SEALs held their ground, but every minute felt like a lifetime measured in muzzle flashes. "Reloading," Jackson barked, slamming a fresh magazine into his rifle. Murphy's hands danced across his screens, sweat dripping down his jaw. "They're rerouting the jammers. Every frequency I try, they're already there. They're shadowing me in real time." "Which means they knew we'd be here," Stevens said grimly. "This isn't chance. This is design." The men didn't answer. They already knew. Another detonated down the corridor, light carving into their vision. The enemy surged, coordinated and relentless. Rounds smacked into the barricade they'd cobbled from debris. Concrete cracked. Shrapnel sliced skin. Harrison grunted, clutching his shoulder again. Blood seeped through fresh bandages, the wound worsening with every movement. Williams dragged him back, voice tight. "You're bleeding out, Bulldog. I can't keep this patched forever." Harrison tried to grin through clenched teeth. Just a scratch, but his pallor betrayed him. Williams's hands trembled for a second. Not fear, frustration. He could keep a man alive in almost any condition, but not if the entire building turned into a coffin. Stevens scanned the chaos. They were cornered, outnumbered, their ammo dwindling. The math was against them and he knew it. And then silence. Not full, but wrong. The enemy's fire shifted, staggered, then faltered. Screams echoed through the smoke, sharp and brief. Murphy's eyes widened at his screens. Heat signatures dropping fast. Jackson swung his scope, catching only glimpses, figures crumpling, falling, dragged into shadow. Shots too precise, too fast. He couldn't even track the shooter. And then she appeared. Collins emerging from the haze like a phantom made flesh. Her weapon whispered, suppressed bursts stitching through enemy lines with surgical precision. She didn't spray. She didn't hesitate. Every trigger pull ended a life. The SEALs froze. For a second they forgot to fire. Slid into cover beside Stevens without looking at him. Calm, composed, not even breathing hard. She tapped something on a small device clipped to her belt. Instantly, the overhead lights flickered and died, plunging the corridor into darkness. "Night vision," Stevens ordered, and the team flipped their goggles down. But moved without them. Her eyes tracked shadows as if she'd memorized every angle of the facility. She fired blind into smoke, yet her shots found flesh. Every time. "Boss," Murphy whispered through comms, "she's not guessing. She knows where they are." Didn't speak, she only fought. And the enemy broke. Not all of them, not yet, but enough. Their coordinated fire scattered, their discipline cracking. Men who had pressed forward with soldierly precision now hesitated, looking for cover that no longer existed. But victory came at cost. Harrison cried out, hit again, this time in the thigh. Williams dropped to his knees, pressure clamps snapping into place, blood-soaking gloves. "Through and through," he shouted. "He's losing too much." Stevens crouched low beside them, bullets slicing overhead. Harrison's face was pale, jaw clenched against pain, his eyes locked on Stevens. "Don't stop. Don't you dare stop." "We're not leaving you," Stevens growled. Glance back. For the first time she met his eyes in combat. Something flickered there, calculation, not emotion. She pressed a compact device into his hand. Sleek, black, unmarked. "Push when you're ready," she said. Her voice was steady, almost indifferent, but the authority in it left no room for doubt. Stevens stared at the device. "What is it?" "Your exit," she said simply. Then she was gone again, vanishing into smoke. He wanted to chase her, demand answers, force her to explain. But rounds snapped past his ear, and Harrison was bleeding out, and his men were waiting for orders. Survival first, questions later. The enemy surged again, desperate now, reckless. Jackson's shots cracked sharp, dropping one, then another. Murphy flooded their comms with interference, momentarily breaking the hostile net. But they couldn't hold forever. Stevens felt the weight of it, the slow collapse of defense, the inevitability of attrition. Even elite warriors bled. Even the best could fall. "Sir," Williams's voice snapped him back. Harrison's pulse fluttered under his fingers. "We're out of time." Stevens looked at the device in his hand. Sleek, simple, a single button. Trust her, a ghost with no orders, no mission, no name. His thumb hovered. Then he pressed. The walls shook as a distant detonation rolled through the facility. Not near them, deeper, strategic. A blast meant not to kill, but to open. Seconds later, a steel bulkhead ahead of them hissed and unlocked. Their exit had given them a path. "Move," Stevens ordered. Jackson laid down cover fire. Murphy grabbed Harrison's other side. Turner hauled gear. Williams clung to his patient with one hand and his rifle with the other. They ran, boots pounding through smoke and chaos, bullets snapping at their heels. As they reached the open corridor, Stevens glanced back. Through the haze stood alone, her silhouette framed in emergency strobes. She fired once, twice, 3 times, each shot precise, each one buying them distance. Then the smoke swallowed her whole. And the SEALs kept running. They didn't know if she was behind them. They didn't know if she was ahead. All they knew was this: without Collins, they'd already be dead. But as Harrison groaned, bleeding between them, and Williams's hands shook with frustration, Stevens couldn't stop the thought that gnawed at him. If she could do all this, why had she waited until they were almost destroyed? Why save them now and not before? The Phantom Soldier wasn't just their ally, she was something else, something they couldn't define. And Stevens was beginning to realize. Maybe she wasn't there to save them. Maybe she was there to test them. What do you call someone who fights like a ghost but bleeds like a soldier? The SEALs stumbled into Sector 7, lungs burning. Harrison barely conscious between Murphy and Williams. Their boots echoed in the cavernous hall, a chamber built to mimic an underground fortress. Steel catwalks crisscrossed above, stairwells coiled into darkness, every corner another possible death. Turner's radio squawked with static, not random controlled, pulses deliberate coded. He frowned. They're signaling to each other, coordinating. They're cutting off every exit we've got. Jackson scanned through his scope, catching fleeting heat signatures. Multiple squads moving in, at least 20, maybe more. They're not rushing, they're surrounding. Stevens' gut tightened. The trap was closing. Williams dropped to one knee, sliding Harrison against the wall. His gloves were slick with blood. "Boss, if we don't him soon, he's done. He needs a bird in the air, not another corridor." But there was no bird, no sky above them. Only steel, concrete, and enemies tightening the noose. Stevens forced himself calm. "We hold this hall, funnel them, make every shot count." The men obeyed without hesitation. They always did. But Stevens saw it in their eyes, the weight of exhaustion, the fear gnawing at discipline. Even the best break eventually. The first wave hit. Shadows surged from the stairwells, rifles flashing. The chamber erupted into chaos, the roar of gunfire shaking the steel girders overhead. Jackson dropped targets with surgical calm, but for every man who fell, 2 more advanced. "Contact right," Murphy shouted, redirecting interference to jam hostile comms. Sparks showered from a panel as he overloaded circuits, buying seconds at best. Turner fired short bursts, teeth bared, every shot defiance. "They're everywhere." Williams cursed, pressing harder on Harrison's wound, even as he raised his sidearm with his free hand. Stevens fired until his rifle clicked empty. He reloaded without thinking, muscle memory carrying him forward. But deep inside, he knew the truth. They were losing. Slowly, inevitably losing. Then, without warning, the enemy fire stopped. Not slow, not staggered, stopped. The chamber echoed with silence broken only by the hiss of ventilation and the ragged breaths of men waiting for the next volley. Stevens froze, his rifle still braced, finger tight on the trigger. Why they stop? Murphy looked down at his display and his eyes widened. "Boss, signatures are disappearing, fast, dozens, vanishing from the grid." Jackson adjusted his scope, searching shadows. What he saw made his blood run cold. Figures falling, not from suppressive fire, not from panic, dropping like puppets cut from strings, each one taken with single surgical strikes. No wasted rounds, no misses. "Contact above," Jackson whispered, but his voice shook with awe more than warning. "It's her." Stevens followed his gaze. On the catwalk, barely visible through haze and flickering light, Collins moved like a phantom. She didn't run, she didn't stumble, she flowed. One step, one shot, one kill. Her suppressed weapon whispered through the chamber, each burst precise. Hostiles collapsed before they even realized she was there. When one squad tried to flank her, the lights above them died, plunging them into blackness. When another squad took cover, the steel railing collapsed beneath them, sending bodies crashing to the floor. She wasn't fighting the battle, she was controlling it. "Holy," Murphy stopped himself mid-curse. "Boss, she's not just one of us, she's—" "I don't know what she is," Stevens cut him off. His voice was hard, but his hands shook. Williams muttered under his breath as he worked on Harrison. "She moves like she's rehearsed this. Every angle, every damn corner." Stevens knew Williams was right. Wasn't reacting, she was anticipating. This wasn't improvisation. This was preparation. The hostiles tried to regroup, their leader barking orders in Russian, but was already there. She dropped into their flank with a silent leap, her weapon clearing 3 men in 2 seconds. The fourth turned, eyes wide, but a blade flashed, swift and final. The SEALs could only watch. Soldiers who had trained to be America's finest, forced into the role of spectators while one woman dismantled an entire hostile force. And yet it wasn't just her skill. It was her calm, no rage, no triumph, just cold precision. Stephen's throat was dry. That's not just training, that's something else. Jackson swallowed hard. Sir, she's killing like it's nothing. Williams's voice cracked, not from fear but from the weight of what he was seeing. She's not fighting for us. She's fighting for something else. Vaulted back onto the catwalk, scanning with predator stillness. The last hostile squad hesitated, panic breaking their discipline. One tried to retreat. He didn't make it 3 steps. Then silence again. The chamber stank of cordite and blood. Bodies sprawled in unnatural positions, rifles scattered across steel and concrete. Stood alone above them, the glow of emergency lights painting her face in crimson. Her expression was unreadable, calm, detached. And for the first time, Stevens felt something heavier than fear. He felt the weight of dependence. Without her, they'd be dead. That much was undeniable, but trusting her meant surrendering control to someone they didn't understand. And that terrified him more than the bullets ever had. She finally looked down at them. Her eyes swept over Harrison's bleeding form, Williams's bloodied gloves, Murphy's pale face, Jackson's rigid stance. Then her gaze locked on Stevens. "Move," she said simply. Her voice echoed in the chamber, steady as stone. "More are coming." Stevens wanted to demand answers, to scream, to curse, to tear the truth out of her. But Harrison groaned, pale and fatting. Williams met his commander's eyes, pleading silently. Stevens swallowed his questions, for now. "On me," he ordered. His voice cracked, but the men followed. They always did. Vanished into the next corridor, already knowing the way. And Stevens realized something he hadn't allowed himself to admit until now. This wasn't their mission anymore. It was hers. And they were just trying to survive inside it. What do you say when the truth is too heavy to speak? The extraction came not with fanfare, not with celebration. No helicopters thundering overhead, no triumphant music. Just a silent convoy of unmarked vehicles waiting at the far perimeter of the desert facility. The SEALs staggered into the dawn, carrying Harrison between them, uniforms torn, faces pale. Their bodies bore the marks of survival, but their eyes carried something deeper: confusion, disbelief, and a fear they didn't want to name. Medical staff swarmed, but not Navy corpsmen, not people they knew. Civilian contractors in gray jumpsuits whisked Harrison onto a stretcher, IVs already running before Williams could protest. "Where are you taking him?" Williams snapped, sweat and blood streaking his face. One of the medics didn't look up. "Classified, he'll live." Williams's jaw clenched. He wanted to demand more, but the rifles slung across the shoulders of the convoy's escorts silenced him. These weren't SEALs. These weren't even military police. They were something else entirely. Murphy lowered his gear slowly, eyes narrowing. "Boss, this doesn't feel like our command." Stevens said nothing. He didn't trust his voice. They were ushered into a separate vehicle. No questions, no explanations, just orders. Hours blurred. The desert rolled past tinted windows, endless sand and scrubland reflecting in exhausted eyes. No one spoke. Not Jackson, whose steady hands had shaken when the gunfire finally ceased. Not Murphy, who usually filled silence with sarcasm. Not even Williams, who kept his head bowed, blood still under his nails. When they finally stopped, it wasn't at base. It was at a structure that didn't exist on any map. A sterile building tucked deep into restricted land, windowless and humming with hidden life. Inside they were split, debriefings in rooms too clean, too cold. Stevens sat under harsh lights, facing a man in a suit who never gave his name. "Your team encountered hostiles?" the man asked, voice flat, recording device already running. "Yes," Stevens said. His throat was dry. "Armed, coordinated, Russian, or at least trained like them." The man nodded without writing. "And yet your team survived." Stevens' jaw tightened. "We survived because of her." A pause, the man tilted his head slightly. Her. Collins, Stevens said firmly. The inspector. Civilian attached to our unit, she fought beside us, saved us. The man leaned back, expression unreadable. There is no record of a Collins attached to your exercise. Stevens froze. That's impossible, he said. She was with us from the start, notebook, observing, my men saw her. The man's eyes remained cold. Perhaps stress, hallucination under combat duress. Hallucination doesn't open sealed doors. Hallucination doesn't kill trained soldiers. Stevens' voice rose, sharp against the sterile room. She was there. Without her, we'd be dead. The man simply clicked the recorder off. This debriefing is concluded. Stevens slammed his hand on the table. You can erase a file. You can delete a name. But you can't tell me what I saw. The door opened. 2 guards escorted him out, their eyes avoiding his. He wasn't alone in this. Jackson sat in another room, hands folded, voice tight as he insisted he'd seen her fight. Murphy argued until his throat cracked, describing her devices, her ability to manipulate systems with impossible ease. Williams, trembling from exhaustion, nearly shouted that she had put a weapon in their commander's hand, given them the exit that saved Harrison's life. But each time, the responses were the same. There is no Collins. The words were repeated like scripture, cold, final, unyielding. When the team finally reunited in a holding lounge, silence pressed heavy. Stevens looked into their faces. Exhaustion, anger, quiet disbelief. They're covering it up, Murphy muttered at last. His voice was low, but venom threaded through it, scrubbing her like she never existed. Jackson rubbed his temples. Boss, what if she wasn't ours? What if she was never supposed to be there? Williams looked up sharply. Then why save us? No one answered. Days blurred into nights. Harrison survived, barely, but even his medical reports came back redacted. The men were released back to their units with no ceremony, no recognition, not even acknowledgement that they had fought real hostiles. Their mission logs were stamped training exercise compromised by environmental failure. Officially, nothing had happened. Unofficially, they all carried the memory of a woman who shouldn't exist. Weeks later, Stevens received a package at his quarters. No return address. Inside, a weapon upgrade he'd never seen before, sleek, compact, untraceable. Alongside it, a single line written on unmarked paper. Guardians don't take orders. They give chances. He held it for a long time, the weight heavier than steel. Across the country, Jackson found an encrypted file hidden in his comms gear, a recording of enemy chatter in Russian. The voices spoke not of an exercise but of interdiction orders. They hadn't been role-playing. They had been hunting, and someone had known. Murphy discovered new code woven into his systems. Cleaner, sharper, beyond his comprehension. Not sabotage, gift. A quiet hand improving his tools without leaving a fingerprint. Williams woke one morning to find Harrison's vitals sent directly to his device, bypassing every official channel. Updates from nowhere. From her. Collins had been erased. But Collins hadn't erased them. They were living proof she existed. Proof hidden in gifts, in memories, in wounds that wouldn't fade. Yet the question gnawed deeper than ever. Who had she been protecting? Them, or something far larger? Stevens lay awake nights, staring at the ceiling, replaying the corridor, the catwalk, the smoke. Her voice echoed in his mind. Move, more are coming. It hadn't been a warning, it had been a truth. Something bigger than them was moving, something they weren't meant to see. And Collins, phantom soldier, ghost, guardian, whatever she was, had stood at the edge of that storm. Not as their ally, not as their enemy, but as something beyond. Why do some names vanish, while others are whispered like ghosts? Weeks passed, the mission faded into silence. Reports vanished into black files never spoken of again. For the men who had bled in that desert facility, the world spun on as if nothing had happened. No recognition, no truth, just shadows where facts should have been. Stevens carried the weight heavier than any rucksack. His men healed. Harrison limped back to duty with scars that told stories no one believed. Williams returned to his medical ward, hands steadier but eyes colder. Jackson trained new recruits, his calm precision now haunted by flickers of a phantom figure he couldn't explain. Murphy dug deeper into code, his humor thin to a razor's edge. But Stevens, he couldn't let it go. Every night he replayed it, the way she moved, the way she dismantled trained soldiers as if reading a script only she could see. The way she had looked him in the eyes, voice calm, words sharp as steel. Move, more are coming. She hadn't been saving them, she had been steering them. One evening, months after the operation, Stevens was summoned. Not to headquarters, not to the Pentagon. To a place he had never been, hidden in a forest far from cities. A building too quiet, too clean, buried beneath earth and reinforced with silence. Inside, a man in a suit, different from the first, sat across from him. Older, colder, the kind of man who wore secrets like a second skin. "You're troubled, Commander," the man said softly, as if stating weather. "I want answers," Stevens replied. His voice was steady, but his fists clenched under the table. The man smiled faintly. "Answers aren't always a gift. Sometimes they're a burden." "Then burden me." A pause stretched. Then the man slid a thin folder across the table, no name on the front, just a single word stamped in faded ink: Phantom. Stevens opened it. Not much inside. Fragments, blacked-out lines, photos blurred or burned, but there was enough to confirm what he had felt in his bones. A program not official, not acknowledged, something built in the shadows, buried beneath layers of denial. A program not for soldiers, not for spies, but for something in between. Guardians, operators who existed outside orders, outside recognition, not bound to command, not leashed to politics. Silent protectors unleashed only when the storm was too great for any flag to weather. Collins had been one of them. The man's voice broke his thoughts. "You were never meant to see her, and yet you did. That means you survived for a reason." Stevens looked up sharply. "Why erase her?" The man folded his hands. "Because names give power, because legends draw eyes. Guardians don't exist to be remembered. They exist to ensure others are." Stevens stared at the folder, at the empty spaces where a life should be, at the phantom that had bled beside him, saved his men, and vanished into silence. He closed it slowly. "And what happens now?" The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Now you return to your unit, you continue your work, and you remember one thing: dignity doesn't speak, it acts." The meeting ended. The folder was taken back. Stevens walked out with nothing in his hands, but the weight of it pressed on him like lead. Outside, the forest was quiet. Birds sang, leaves whispered. The world carried on, blind to shadows. But Stevens knew. He knew she was still out there. Not for him, not for his men, not even for their country. For something larger, for storms that couldn't be named. And though the world would never know her name, though files would deny she ever lived, though history would leave her blank, Stevens carried her in silence. Because some truths aren't spoken. They're carried. And some legends don't need voices. They only need to exist. Collins was gone, erased, forgotten. But to the men she saved, to the commander who saw her stand alone in smoke and fire, she would always be more than a phantom. She would be the reminder that sometimes the strongest warriors are the ones who never ask for credit, never demand recognition, never wait for orders. They simply act. And when the dust settles, when the smoke clears, when the world spins on without knowing what it owes, her silence will remain. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.